Welcome back to Driving Force Radio. We are having this fantastic discussion today with the Spatial Terra Consulting Group. And Kelly, there are so many things in this conversation that are compelling and really intriguing, but it really goes back to the founders of the organization.
Yeah, so what we've been talking about is how they are taking innovation and the implementation of that innovation in the social environment. And so can you guys tell us a little bit about, give us a better idea of your background and how did this idea come about, or how did you pull this concept together?
Scott, can you go first?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I have a long history in business, small, medium, and large business. I grew up in small business. I don't want to do this whole, back to my birth type history, but I do think those elements are important to understand, because in having worked in the areas of sales and marketing and also as a business owner, there's a lot of pieces just in the way you look at things as a business owner that are very relevant. And understanding, especially small business, having to really understand the fidelities of your market, which is key. And it's not an insult, but there's a very formed and proven way of doing business. Then you have the inventor, the creator of technology, which is, I have the best idea, which is passionate, and I totally relate to that. I mean, that's that artistic spin that goes into the technical solution. What we try to do is we work towards that. Bad news can be good news if we can identify those ways of making your stuff work better. That's kind of the key. But I think it's always a challenge, and I think that's just entering into those. And then you also, no matter where you come in, when you're going to start tearing a model apart and you start, we say pulling back the layers of the onion to look deep, that's not comfortable for anybody. But that's our role, and that's ultimately, at the end of the day, I guess I would liken it towards a remodel of a house. Okay, so you come in and it sounds like a good idea, and it's like, oh great, my contractor's coming in, and then okay, super, here's the dream, and once the first tear out's great because everything's happening, and then comes that long process of, okay, I got to get the electrician in, and I got to get the plumber in. Oh, here's the discovery of dry rot, and here's the discovery of bad wiring. We've all had this, right? Yeah. And now the paycheck starts going up. You're like, oh, this is awful. And the time starts to run out a bit. It's that painful process in between, but then if it's done right, at the end, everything that you'd wanted becomes what you'd hoped for and better.
Yeah.
So talk me through how traditional business learns to get it, because I think they're so steeped in their ways of doing business. And this is big corporations, medium corporations, sometimes even small organizations. They're so stuck in what they learned at grad school and getting their MBA and all of that stuff that this social media, this social influx seems to have passed them by. And I think they're sort of stuck. And I think you've seen it through Home Depot, you see it through oil and gas, as you've talked about. You see it in domestic projects going on all over our country as well as internationally. How do you teach a business to get it?
I think the first piece of that is what we work off of, what we call the narrative. We really have to understand how the business not just communicates, but how it's receiving its information and seeing the world. Yeah. It sounds like a technical solution. It's actually not. I mean, this isn't just, we're not talking mechanical, like, I get it through email. I'm talking about literally, how are you visualizing your world? Yeah. And that's a process of sitting down literally and just having a conversation. But it's not just the conversation of management. If we have to work internally to that culture first to understand what that internal culture that it is, right? So that's the same application as like working in a village. I can't worry about the outside of the village until I understand what the village is. Right. So we're sitting down and we're literally talking to the CEO, we're talking to that next person down, we're talking to the engineers, we're talking to the secretaries, we're wanting to understand what it is that you're understanding that not just your role, but where the business works and how that business sees its environment that it's working in. Once we start to find a common dialogue, then it's a process then of translating what we're finding to a language that you can understand. It's the crawl, walk, run. Mm-hmm. We're not looking, I think this is a big piece. As consultants, you kind of accept that what you produce is on the onus of the client to implement. But really, that to me is a bit of a cop-out, and that's never our goal. Our attempt here is to move something in so it becomes part of your dialogue and part of your narrative and part of your communication, and that you own it. And if you own it, then you'll be able to work with it. And it's a dynamic process. It doesn't just happen one-off. But if we can get to those places, it's about providing the framework to look at the problem differently. It's about changing the conversation. It's about being able to understand where you were entering into the conversation, how that conversation has to change, and what type of new things you have to embrace to move forward, but not all at once. And that's again that crawl, walk, run. If you suddenly come in with this encyclopedia of, here you go, here's a change, it's going to go one place, it's going to go on the shelf, or the second place, it's going to go in the recycling bin. And they're going to point to that and say, hey, that was a great whatever cost study, and it did nothing for us. And that's not our attempt here. And it's a slow process. Some places get it, some places don't right away.
And I think there's a misconception that successful organizations, innovative organizations have a game room, they have flex time. That's not necessarily it. And the more staid corporations we deal with, the more staid clients we have will say, we don't want to become that. But it's really about that narrative and understanding who you really are. And it starts with the organization. If they can't describe themselves in that way that Scott described, then typically what we're seeing is a top-down organization that has very entrenched ideas, and they want to fit this onto that and make it just that way, and then they're never really seeing the local solution.
So if I may, just real quick on this, because we talk a lot about the social space, and it's a foreign environment for a lot of industry.
Right.
So, and I because we've been doing a lot of work around oil and gas, I just want to throw this out. And it's not, again, this is not a criticism, but it's an acceptance that there's a new space to work in. When you don't understand something, you can often fear something. And if you fear something, the best way to deal with it is to ignore it. The issue is, though, as I believe I said earlier, we're one Twitter feed away, literally, from a global incident. And when you are a global company working in global environments, you can no longer ignore the power of those sorts of things. So you're going to have to embrace new ways of doing business, because if you continue down conventional ways of doing business, it's going to be painful, it's going to be costly, and you're not going to be competitive, and that's the big piece. So when you start to look at, for example, social media, it's interesting to note that there's not a lot of investment going on in that social space. I mean, how many oil companies do we know that are putting money into Hollywood? And my question is, why not? This is a vehicle to communicate a story. Now, this is a very indirect approach. The classic answer is, it doesn't have to do with PR, and it doesn't have to do with marketing. PR is problem set driven, and marketing is product driven. But what we're talking about is neither. What we're talking about is influence and messaging, and we're also talking about presenting your case of the story. So when I hear, as I hear too often, how atrocious Hollywood is in portraying the message, my answer is simple. Well, how much money have you put into the problem? Okay? It's a money-driven issue. So if you decide to hire somebody to produce a script to tell a story, it's fiction, like everything else is fiction, but it's an investment into messaging. And this is the part of you have to start accepting that there's a different way of doing business out here, and messaging is part of it. And that has to go into your global strategies. And it's not just, like I said, just coming up with, oh, this is a great thing we want to tell. It has to be looked at in the sense of the social context and the audiences that you're trying to receive or send to.
Okay, I'm just going to say it. Let's take on the issue of fracking.
Okay.
It's generally perceived as a bad word in a lot of spaces, especially in this Rocky Mountain region. So how would you apply your conceptual model to that issue?
I think this is a great one, and we're starting to open this discussion. So fracking to me is really pretty much a tragedy where we're at right now. And I'm going to put a lot of the onus on those doing the fracking. And I'm doing this because there's been an assumption that by providing technical solutions to a public that they will get it. The answer is they won't. Okay? We're not engineers. Right. And when you speak engineer speak, I can sit through engineer speak, and I can tell you I can get lost any day of the week. And when I get lost, I'm not within the problem. Fracking has, like all things, we have issues people are concerned about, especially when we start to deal with extraction of something within your backyard, and we start to talk about water processing, and we start to talk about all these issues that get people spun up on fracking. What people need to understand is how to understand that in the relation to their emotional response to the problem. We haven't seen enough effort put in to trying to get to that space. And the most important thing is how to change the conversation. Right now, we've got emotionally charged and ideological driven one side, which is environmentalists and also locals. If you're a farmer, for example, and here's a really good example. We take farmer, and you're on a water restricted area, somewhere near the Colorado River, downstream, right? And suddenly you say, well, we're going to put fracking in. Okay, what's that going to be? Well, we're going to take X metric tons of water out of your space. All I know is what you just told me is my water costs are going to go up. Now, have you translated that to me in terms of how many gallons it's going to be, how you're going to collect that water, when you're going to collect that water? If you're going to collect it on the rainy season, for example, and it has a zero net effect on me, and you're going to be recycling that water, using it over and over, my argument's mute. But I haven't translated in terms of how it directly affects my pocketbook. So there's not enough of that discussion going on. So in application of this model, really what we've looked at is, how can we start looking at fracking differently? And fracking is an issue that's important. I mean, this is something, if we can start to really produce here well and find that relationship, not only does it drive jobs, it also changes the United States relationship globally to be a net exporter. And when you change that, now just think about the rippling effects of that. Now you challenge OPEC, you start to take its new alliances like with Venezuela and Brazil, and you peel them off. You start to degrade OPEC's influence on, and you start to achieve what we've wanted as a culture, which is energy independence. That whole message, I would argue that has a linkage in the conversation that has not been presented. It's very local about, we have the right answer, you have the wrong answer, and we've got two sides that just clash. So in looking at fracking, it's not easy. And I'm not going to try to sit here and say that we can walk in and wave the Spatial Terra banner and everybody rallies around and says, hold hands and sing Kumbaya, because that's not going to happen. We're dealing now with rift, and we're dealing with trenched-in conflict, and we're dealing with reified positions. So that's a challenging space. That gets into what we call conflict resolution or conflict mitigation. So that's going to take some time, but it takes localized effect and localized focus, training sides, engaging in both sides, getting the conversation to change, and getting people to come to the table.
So Scott, you're talking about fracking and those kinds of things, but is there really a model that you've seen that's similar to this, in where there's conflict, from one side and conflict from the other, and nobody seems to be talking the same language, where you've actually seen it come together and work?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is one of the great things. Oregon has one of the great models for this that dealt with the Applegate Watershed Council. And though I wasn't personally involved, my brother was centerpiece to the success. So it's a fantastic example of what can be done. So here's the example. We're dealing with a logging area down into a sensitive environmental area. And here's the players, okay? You've got loggers that are ready to do clear cutting, okay? This is very personal to Oregon, right? Because we're a very tree-driven or resource-driven, and where you have natural gas one place, we have trees, right? So we have the extraction of the resource, the jobs that related to that, and that's business. You have the environmentalist flash up that occurs right there, and it's hostile environmentalism to include things like spiking trees, so when loggers cut through, their chainsaws blow up, and I mean it's vicious, right? And then you've got the farmers and the ranchers who have been told by the state that there's certain restrictions on how they can clear cut manage their land, that they've even had to pay out of their own pocket to rebuild stream sections, which ended up being wrong. Okay, so that was going to be a new cost for them. You have the Fishermen's Association, which is all about preserving the native flow of fish. And then you have the local community that's like, hey, we've got to vote too, what about us? Which is a whole mix of events.
Right.
So in this whole process, how do you get a solution? I mean, you literally have ideologically, emotionally driven sides that have very unnice things to say to each other, right?
Sure.
And you even have those fringe elements that, by all accounts, if we were in a conflict zone, you just qualify them as terrorists, because they're out to say, I'll burn your equipment, I'll spike your trees, I'll do whatever I need to do. And you can just imagine the emotions coming up. The success of the Watergate solution, Applegate Watershed Council solution, was the persistent and constant engagement in finding and changing the conversation and getting through those ideological layers and emotional layers to get people to find the common thread of the narrative. And that's where it sits. And this is the great model that we really look at, because if it can be done in something like that, honestly, it can be done anywhere. It just takes time, it takes some patience, and it takes a different way of doing business. And I have to stress that. You can't just throw the engineer out there and say, hey, everything's good. Or you can't just throw the state representative out there going, I voted for it, everything's good. Now imagine adding to the mix, which we've seen all over, you have the state representative that takes a side directly or indirectly by passing new measures of regulation. You start to add a whole new layer of a problem. So it's all about conversation. And the most key piece, and I know I keep saying this, but it's what we band on, which is the narrative. What is it? What are people really saying? And at the core of this, what is the piece that they're hearing? And how are they seeing the problem?
Yeah.
And when we start to peel that away, it's pretty amazing, because we can often get to some very simple truths. And once we start to bridge those differences, we start to have a conversation that starts to be intelligible. We can tone down the emotions, and it has to have obviously restrictions on it, and there has to be some time, because you have to let people process and move through this, especially when you get into rift.
Well, and I want to talk about that. I would imagine that this isn't just 2 or 3 meetings that this happens in, that this takes some time, and obviously you've got to shift the way people are perceiving things and get everybody going again. Talk about timing.
Well, I think timing is everything. I think that this is a problem, unfortunately indicative to this modern generation. And when I say this, for the last 30, 40 years, we have become so accustomed to the image that everything is fast.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
It's everything from the way we get our food, it's to we want something, we buy it on the internet and it comes now, to even how we run wars. Because the perception of wars is, oh, we've got a little video picture, we're going to blow up a site, it's all over, we're done. We're not used to dealing with consequence over the long term. And the longer that we have existed as a country, long-term consequence becomes a bigger and bigger issue. And the more diversity that we develop within our culture, the more complex it begins. Add another layer onto this. In a digital age, relationships aren't better, they're more complicated. And this is an interesting thing for people to hear. They go, oh, I've got Facebook. Yes, but you don't have human interaction. Mm-mm. So when you look at the dynamics of digital interaction versus human interaction, it's a whole new level of experience. Things our parents took for granted are now almost new to learn, and that's the consequence of what you say, for example. So it is definitely a enduring process, one that takes time, and it takes a patience to be able to work through it. And it's not like you're sitting at the desk every day working it. It's an engagement, it's a pullback. It's an engagement, it's a pullback. Mm-hmm. So the expectation management is a big part of this, is we have to be very realistic. When you start talking about a problem that's had 3 or 4 years or 5 years or longer to build, and you're at that crisis point, you're not going to solve it in 3 meetings. But you can solve it over time by starting with a process of engagement and listening.
And you know what else it does is, we talk a lot about on this show about the sort of the energy transition that we're in, and how people are now sort of more responsible for your making energy choices. So right now it looks like we're transitioning to either electric vehicles or natural gas vehicles. So people are having to be proactive, reach out and figure out, you know, what's the best choice for me, what's the best choice for my family, what's the best choice for my personal values. So that's what it sounds like to me, that you're asking people to become more engaged, not just based on fear, but you're asking them to really look at these problems and consider the other person's perspective. And that is truly how we're going to move forward and solve a lot of these problems. And it's interesting how it ties into a lot of our other conversations that we have on this show.
Well, I would agree with this. So this is a little example, a tiny one, but I think it shows how we look at problems. So there's been this massive push to get more fuel-efficient vehicles, and we've done very well as a country. Our consumption has fallen. But now it comes out about 2 weeks ago that the highway fund has no money. This is interesting. Now, why don't they have any money? Of course, the conversation starts as, oh, it's been expenditures. No, it's not. It's because the way the gas tax is structured, it's based on consumption of fuel. We aren't consuming the fuel, but we have more vehicles on the road. So now, with less money in the fund, now they're talking about adding a 46-cent tax on gas, okay? Because the government's having to compensate because less people are driving and using less fuel. Yeah. So there's a consequential problem. And this is based because our systems are structured on an old way of doing business. There's a lot of innovation that has to come here. And that innovation is, as Pete said earlier, client-driven. Mm-hmm.
And Kelly, you hit on it. You really encapsulated that technical piece with the social piece, because you talked about fear. Kind of the fear-driven decisions that we make, or the desire-driven decisions that we make, that really are the motivations that describe our narrative. And that's true of the domestic environment, different regions, different places we're operating, but also overseas. There are commonalities of human beings, of things they fear that they're moving away from or desire that they're moving towards. but they're buried under layers and layers of narrative, as Scott described, and defensive and conversations that have been taking place over generations. So what we do is peel all that back, but with an eye on those technical solutions, those technical issues like the gas tax that have secondary and tertiary consequences.
So gentlemen, what's next? Where is Spatial Terra headed next? What's next for the organization, and how can businesses learn more about the organization?
Well, we're continuing to move into markets, and we're doing a lot of focus on energy and gas, and oil and gas. And I think that is, well, and I would add energy just in general, because we're not limiting that to oil and gas. We're also looking at green technologies. I think that's going to be a primary push for us. And we're not limiting ourselves to that market, but it is, as far as a business development focus, that's really where we're zeroed in on. We maintain a foothold into working with DoD and Department of State, a light one, but it's important because that's that bridging component too, to really keep abreast on those two cultures, and keep pace with those. I mean, there's some really fantastic innovations that happen on both sides, and the interesting piece is that when the way our rules are set, unlike, say, China, that has a unification of military and corporate, we have a separation. So the fact that we're able to appropriately firewall off our sides but keep an operational presence in both allows us to crossbreed and cross-pollinate ideas in some very, very healthy ways. So as a focus going forward, we're definitely looking at energy as a cumulative whole, of a big focus on us, and where we can make that impact and take what we're doing.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
It is.
And if people want to watch your documentary, where can they find that?
Okay, so I have to admit a little bit of delay on this one. The documentary was an original documentary. I won an Emmy for work that I did in media shorts back in 2007. The documentary was originally crafted to be released about 2008. But due to some challenges with the producer and some licensing issues with music, I pulled it back. So it's in recraft right now. Okay. Name has changed. It was originally known as At War. The new documentary that's coming out will be called Bards of War. It's going to be an interesting look from a soldier's perspective on really some of the, interestingly enough, what really the effect of social issues were in Afghanistan and what soldiers were doing, not from a political impact, but how their impact was based more in a socioeconomic piece, which is very different than the strategies presented by General Petraeus under Coyne. So it's got a little bit of a contention, I'm sure, coming out with it. We'll see where that goes. Yeah. But that's forthcoming, and I project that'll be out at the end of the summer of 2013.
Well, hopefully we'll stay in touch and we'll be able to put that out there. Scott, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Pete, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And to learn more about Spatial Terra, go to spatialterra.com. Well, this last hour with Scott and Pete, as well as Kelly, has been so enlightening. And this conversation that I am sure there are a lot of people that don't really understand is really this high-level introduction of how technology solutions are really going to bridge this bigger social conversation that's going on globally, especially as we begin to open up new markets and develop new technologies in these developing markets, whether it be Africa, the Middle East, or even Latin America. And the interesting part of this that Pete and Scott really understand is from the Afghanistan markets and from markets all over the world, and how to bridge those instabilities while still trying to do good. And we applaud Spatial Terra and Scott and Pete as they add new global partners and digital networks to this bigger channel. And develop these economic principles in these new markets. It's going to require a competitive intelligence and a business environment with on-the-ground training, and that's going to be so key going forward. And the most interesting thing, I think, is that while we don't necessarily understand all of the dynamics that go into this, there are proven models, and it's the Applegate watershed models and various solutions that are both here domestically as well as internationally. And it's really a solutions model that has been proven to work. And so if you are interested in and need to know more about crisis communication and mitigation, as well as legacy issues, and that you truly understand that these social spaces are dynamic and fluid, Scott and Pete and the Spatial Terra organization really do have something to offer. So whether it's community organizations, fracking, oil and gas, new clean energy technologies, big issues surrounding multiple industry sets, you need the work of Spatial Terra and their ability to really bridge those gaps. So again, it's spatialterra.com or bardsofwar.com. And for us here at ICOSA, we're so happy to have Scott and Pete here. If you want to learn more, please go to our site and read their story at theicosamagazine.com. Again, that's theicosamagazine.com. As always, Kelly, thank you. This was a really fun show.
Yeah, it's such an important conversation in this transitioning energy economy that we have.
Absolutely. How can listeners find you?
On rapidtechtransit.com and also my blog, RockyMountainEnergyBlog.com.
Well, perfect. Have a great weekend, and thanks so much for joining us here at Driving Force Radio.